Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 28th of November 2023. I've just got back from, well not just, I've been back for some time, from the Turkish barbers where I go for my occasional cleanup. Every square centimetre of my head has been carefully attended to. I've had hot wet towels on my face. I've had a cutthroat barber shave, so my face is as smooth as the baby's bum, if a little raw. I haven't wet shaved since I was in my early 20s because my skin can't handle it. And anyway, the Turkish do a good job. The Turkish barbers do a good job, and what a wonderful experience it always is. And he shaved my sides. Because I was, had a face full of hair, and I normally have these big mutton chops. He didn't quite know where they started and ended, and I had my eyes closed, and he was just shaving away, and he shaved into. I could poke someone's eye out with my sides. I don't know if you can see them, but really sharp diagonal sides. So there you go. That's always a bit of fun, isn't it? Right, what are you talking about? Just to remind you that hopefully this evening I'm going to be having a live chat co-stream with the Greg Terry experience with Greg Terry. He is an American, complete opposite end of the philosophical spectrum to me, but he is very pro-Ukraine. In fact, he's been out there, I think, a number of times. It's going to be really interesting talking to him.
You can see just a playground, right? Kind of normal, right? Let's turn around and let's start here, Jacob. The absolute destruction.
So it's going to be really interesting to talk about his experiences and his thoughts on the whole conflict. Okay, let's get to the front line. If you haven't seen my maps before, check out the Frontline update mapping legend. And then you can look at the key. Oh, God, never fails to amuse me. Right, anyway, let's go to the front line. Starting in the northeast, going from the Kupyansk to Zaporizhzhia to Kreminna axis. I'm still laughing at my stupidity. And as you can see, Andrew Perpetua had some fairly significant gain, well, at least a number of pins. Thanks to JO, who's done the mapping again. God, I don't know what I'd do without him. The Russians have made some gains around Sinkivka to the north of there. It has been a bit of a yo-yo. It depends which mapper you look at here. In fact, it just reminds me, I don't have my Andrew Perpetua map there, which should actually show you the gains. There we go. Wasn't really reacting. So you can see that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back, and the Russian defensive line is now just north of Sinkivka, a lot closer to the town than it previously was. The ISW Institute for the Study of War does say a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces captured new unspecified positions near Sinkivka, and other mill bloggers reported heavy fighting in the area. Russian sources also claim there are ongoing meeting engagements in the Serebyansky forest area, particularly near Dubrova. By meeting engagements, I don't think they're shaking hands and having a meal. So anyway, heavy activity around Sinkivka, and then we come on down to Serebyansky Forest to Dubrova, and actually mentioned Dubrova and Kuzymyrna for ages, but quite a lot of fighting around there, not quite sure exactly where. And then we come on down to Bakhmut, and actually there's nothing really to report in terms of what's going on in Bakhmut. The mappers don't signify any changes there, and actually the ISW, I mean, it talks a lot, but there's not really anything to share with you that isn't sort of repelled attacks, claimed pushes here, claimed pushes there, but no real change. Same can be said about Horlivka, actually, although it appears that the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians back, so they have countered in this area. There's no mapping changes at the moment, but we had this opportunistic success with the Ukrainians there around these spoilings, these tailings heaps or spoil heaps, or indeed slag heaps around the mines near Horlivka. And now, yeah, the Russians pushing the Ukrainians back maybe, or at least, it's somewhat more positional. Then we come down to the Avdiivka area, and you can see that there's quite a bit of difference, or it's not a huge number of pins compared to what we have seen, but they are in 3 different places. So we have Russian gains, as according to Deep State maps, north of Krasnohorivka. Syriac maps pro-Russian mapper has Ukrainian gains around Stepova, and we'll just see what they have to say about that. So that is here. And the Syriac map says the Ukrainian army launched a counterattack and re-entered in some parts of Stepova, forcing Russian troops to withdraw to the railway. Meanwhile, in the southern axis, the Russian army took full control over Vinogradniki Dachas following Ukrainian withdrawal, reaching the quarry at the outskirts of the city. As you can see from Syriac maps, the Russians now have full control of that entire area. You can see Andrew Perpetua still waiting for confirmation of the kind of northwestern sector of that industrial zone to be under Russian control. Nonetheless, I guess as per normal, these two mappers disagree. They occasionally agree, but more often than not, they don't. And here they are agreeing, but that's as a result of a counter-attack, as according to several sources actually have reported this, that the Ukrainians did push the Russians back in the Stepova area, back to the railway line. Deep State map still has some control for the Russians of a little bit of the tree lines around there. Okay, so that is Avdiivka. Let's see what some of the other sources say. Euromaidan Press says the battle for Avdiivka intensifies as Russia launches offensive from two new directions. Russians keep storming the Avdiivka coke plant, yet Ukrainian troops maintain control of the territory, according to the head of the city administration. Actually, the ISW says that Stupin, the spokesperson for the Ukrainians, stated that Russian forces are attacking in 6 directions in the Avdiivka area. And I guess that's going to be really north of Krasnohorivka, west of Krasnohorivka. That would be the Vesely, kind of Kamyanka area, and then around the industrial zone here, and then possibly around Spartak, so slightly separate from that industrial zone, and then towards Severny from Vodyany, that area. I presume that's the 6. Although there's talk about Krutabolka as well. That's not something we have seen on the very much the eastern side of Avdiivka. So we go back to the ISW. Russian sources reiterated claims that Russian forces captured all of the industrial zone southeast of Avdiivka and reached Avdiivka's southeastern outskirts. This is something of a worry. A Russian news aggregator claimed that elements of the Veterani Assault Brigade and the Redut private military company, that's the Veterani is of the MOD affiliated Redut. So Redut is Shoigu's personal PMC, were primarily responsible for the claimed Russian capture of the industrial zone. So PMCs are operational in the area. Stupin stated that poor weather conditions in the Avdiivka area heavily reduced Russian artillery fire and drone use, but that Russian aviation is still active in that area. Okay, so let's go on to a few other sources. Here is no report saying of Avdiivka, no confirmed changes. East of Stepova, the Ukrainians reportedly counterattacked and pushed Russians out to the outskirts of the settlement for the second time. South of Avdiivka, in the industrial zone, fighting continues with still a large area sitting in the grey zone. So no reports would disagree very much with what Syriac Maps is saying of the industrial area to the southeast of Avdiivka, but perhaps confirming what Syriac Maps has claimed about the Ukrainian counterattack near Stepova. And then there's plenty of footage still coming out. I mean, I could show you this. In fact, I probably can show you this footage. There's nothing dodgy about this. It is just watching Russian mechanized units working in some kind of assault, moving to the right of the picture, although there is one moving in the other direction. There's no kind of blowing up, nothing happening, but they are using smoke, and then they do sort of, I think, come up against the claim in the tweet is to come up against infantry retaliation and doing a bit of an about face there. So I don't know that it shows us anything other than that they are still using mechanized equipment in the area, even though there are claims that they're more heavily infantry based at the moment, and that is still a very active area. Russian occupiers hope to advance in battle formations and armored vehicles under tank smoke cover. However, Ukrainian soldiers intervened in their advance. It doesn't really show too much of the actual intervention there. Right, to move on in terms of the front line. So that is to say that It's still looking exceptionally challenging for the Ukrainians, especially in that southeastern area where the Russians are putting an awful lot of pressure and moving closer to the main settlement of Avdiivka, although that is separated by some fortified forest areas. But yeah, challenging. Good to see the Ukrainians have done a successful counterattack potentially. But if they're attacking in 6 areas, the Russians, it's going to be a hard task for the Ukrainians to contain those advances. And there have been a number of attacks, I think 9 attacks in the Mariinka and Novomykhailivka area over the last day, if I remember correctly. 9 Russian assaults in those 2 areas combined. So it's still active there, although no changes to the mapping. Still active in Velika Novoselka. In fact, as according to Andrew Perpetua, some gains northeast of Pryutne, which is sort of in line with what Surat Maps has for the northernmost point of the Russian defensive line, give or take. Not too much of a change there, but it is still active, just not in a way it was sort of 2 months ago plus. And then we move to the west to the Robotyne area where, as you can see, Surat Maps, according to them, there is some gains for the Russians just north of Novoprokopivka, although the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back towards Kopani, and we know that Kopani has been a bit of a focus for the Ukrainians continually. Well, here Surat says the situation on the Zaporizhzhia front. During the last 5 days, Ukrainian armies made small advances north of Novoprokopivka, which is, I don't know. We've got Russian gains there. I don't know if that is subsequent to this coming out. There's no further tweet, but JR, I presume, has done there must be a mapping change there to suggest that, because that sits behind the Russian defensive line. So I think Surat Maps has updated since then, but before then they were claiming that the Ukrainians have made some gains in Novoprokopivka, and it could be just reversing that rather than the Russians making a gain. Maybe they weren't sure that the Ukrainians actually made that territorial advance, but certainly towards Kopani, Surat Maps seems to think that west of Robotyne, the Ukrainians have achieved a bigger advance there. And then we have some geolocated footage. Where we go to the ISW, they say geolocated footage published on the 26th shows that Ukrainian forces made marginal advances south of Robotyne. So this might be around that Novoprokopivka area. Now here, there's a lot of footage here that shows, it shows a Ukrainian attack using vehicles, and 3 Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed. There's other destroyed vehicles around them that are older, both Ukrainian and Russian. So this is an attack towards Kopani in this area. Let's go and see what the initial geolocation indicates, or where it indicates. Yep, so that is on the way on the way west towards Kopani, a little bit to the south there. Right, goes on to say rough geolocation of a couple of Ukrainian BTRs destroyed. These sort of APC type vehicles, and that is again in that same general area, though a little bit closer to Russian lines. So if that's a Russian defensive line and you've got active BTRs, I would suggest that that's probably a grey zone. At the very least, that's a grey zone. Even if that vehicle is destroyed, it's probably unlikely. I mean, they could be assaulting literally the tree line there, so that might be the case. But I would suggest it probably means that the Ukrainians have advanced. Ukrainian vehicle burning south next to some older vehicles. We're actually going to go on here where we have Ukrainian soldiers trying to evacuate one of their soldiers getting shelled by the Russians. So this is where Ukrainian soldiers are, and that might give us a more solid indication of Ukrainian positions. Actually, this is further to the east, south of Robotyne, on the way to Novoprokopivka, right in the grey zone there. So that could again signify an advance in a different position. And here we have Russian shell the northern end of the same tree line. So we've been that'll be further north of where we were there. And then here we have Russian soldiers of the 70th Motorized Rifle Regiment recapture a Ukrainian-held dugout between Robotyne and Novoprokopivka. And I wonder if that underwrites the Surat maps change in that area. So Russian soldiers recapture this area. See if that tracks with what JR has put as Surat maps. Russian gains there. So I have to put that in again. Yes, exactly. So that interesting. So what has happened then is we've had a Ukrainian attack in that area to the south of Robotyne on the way to Novoprokopivka. The Ukrainians made some gains there, and then the Russians immediately counterattacked and took it back. And shelled the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians pulled out. So that pretty much tracks with everything Surat Maps has said of what has happened there. And then in this other area to the west of Robotyne, the Ukrainians appear to have made some ground, or at least they were in positions that would indicate an advance. The question always is, have they stayed there? Is it sustained? Is it an attack and they've gone back to where they started, in which case there's no advance? ISW has interpreted that as saying shows the Ukrainian forces made marginal advances. But I guess we'll see whether that is sustained. Surat Maps does have gains for the Ukrainians, particularly to the north of some of those geolocations, but only marginally to the north. So active there still. That seems to be the most active area of the whole southern front line, really. That area from Kupyansk down to Novoprokopivka, that area of the salient. So after that, we come to Kherson, and no changes to the mapping there, which I think is the longer it goes on, there are no changes to the mapping, the more challenging that becomes for the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, it's not easy for the Russians there. We've had so many Russian sources claiming it is really problematic here. Dmitry from War Translated says Russian occupier who came to Ukraine for $2,000 a month is complaining that the command is sending him and his comrades to a sure death on the Dnipro Islands, says they're getting flooded all the time, and at this point they don't even care about drones. So drones are, as you can see from this footage, there is water all around. I'll just read you what he says just to give you some idea. So this is our hut. It's basically swamped, or rather what's left of it. We got everything flooded. I mean, look at that. That's not looking good, really, is it? I'll play this out. All sleeping spaces are underwater. Somehow guys manage to lay there. I mean, goodness me. That's where they have to sleep. That's where they've been told to fight, to defend. I don't give a damn about drones, because I don't. He says. Yesterday it was snowing. And I'll pause that and just to go a little bit quicker. So this is all we managed to save. He just shows some guns and a few bits of kit, some body armor. That's it. There it is, the shore. Effing awesome. He says, OF, where are you sending the guys for real? To a sure death? So he's obviously not the happiest chappie in town. And that seems to be indicative of a large swathe of Russian fighters in the area. Here's another Russian source. Krynky left bank update says Peacedale 1-1. There are losses. The enemy is smashing us. The command is not responding. Okay, so what is said? At the moment, everything looks like the enemy is simply luring us out under his artillery in small groups deployed to our shore. We throw several assault squads into the assault, which come under continuous artillery fire, tank fire, attacks from kamikaze drones and small arms combat. This is the only way I can explain that we cannot take this piece of land within a month every day by sending more and more new detachments and groups, of which not all return. In addition to everything, there are several formations operating in our sector which carry out the assigned task, each in their own way, without coordinating their actions with their neighbours. All this together leads to very large losses of the Red Army, mostly wounded, but no more dead there either. Few. Bit of a weird translation. I do not expect the command to hear me. I'm simply voicing my opinion, which coincides with the opinion of the officers of our Red Army, that it is time to change tactics and it is no longer for us to storm them, leaving the guys on the battlefield every day, but on the contrary, to invite the adversary to try to break out of our boiler under our heavy artillery fire. This is a really interesting point, actually, and I would say he probably has got a point. I'm starting to think that this whole sector is something of a meat grinder for the Russians. It will be difficult for the Ukrainians, of course it will, and they'll be losing out to things like aviation, but even the aviation there is hitting some of their own Russian troops. And from all the reasons I talked about yesterday, how it's so difficult for the Russians to get their troops here, they're still getting them there and sending them in, but I don't think they can do these wide-ranging attacks because they can probably only get them in certain pinch points, and that means that it's a lot easier for the Ukrainians, arguably, to know where the Russians are and hit them, as I said, with artillery, tank fire, and ATGMs and whatnot, and drones, of course. And so I think this is probably really attritional for the Russians, and it makes me start to think it could be a useful attritional meat grinder, very much like Bakhmut. So although there is this idea that they need to expand and need to get a much greater foothold here, and they need to sooner rather than later, because the winter isn't going to be the right time to try to expand on a bridgehead here. Conditions are just not great. At the same time, if the Russians are going to continue trying this kind of active defense, then that might work in Ukraine's favor in the long run. And this could end up attriting Russian forces in the area quite fundamentally, and then leave them in a weaker state so that Ukraine can actually launch an even stronger attack and have more success. If the Russians do what this guy says they should, which I'd agree, which is, do you know what, sit back in your defensive lines and let the Ukrainians come to us, then the Russians might well be able to soak up that Ukrainian attack and hammer the Ukrainians with their own kind of artillery. I know the artillery is less effective here, the range is not as good as the Ukrainians, but if they are inviting the Ukrainians onto them, then so for example, if I just draw this out, and this is going to be somewhat arbitrary, but if the Russians say, right, we know that if we take it to them around here, right? So if we're around here, then the Ukrainians' artillery and mortars can just hammer us easily, and they have greater range over us. But if we were to go back here, right, and let them come to us, and then as they're coming through this kind of area here, we hammer them with everything we've got that can be somewhat closer than it would be right to the shore of the river, the bank of the river, then the Ukrainians might well find that very expensive in terms of losses to do so. And it would also mean that they might get their tails up and start trying to bring heavy equipment across, and then if Russia can get some drone activity to work and some, I don't know, some artillery that can reach there, maybe they can hammer the equipment as it comes across the river. I don't know, lure them into doing that, which is what this guy suggests, leaving the guys in the battlefield every day, but on the contrary, invite the adversary to break out of our boiler under heavy artillery fire. So, it's up to you guys to come to us, and we're going to hammer you with artillery, rather than us doing this active defense and us being hit by your artillery. If you want to attack, you come at us. So, and I can understand that. It seems to make sense to me. Anyway, that's enough of me for the Frontline update. That is what has happened. It is obviously dynamic in certain places, but essentially it hasn't particularly changed. Worries still exist in and around Avdiivka, but also interestingly Sinkivka showing some changes there as well. Anyway, take care, speak soon, and please check out the live chat a little bit later with Greg Terry.